All right, we are live. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are really pleased to have Lauren with us today. And yeah, we hope that everyone is really healthy and that everyone is doing well. And anyone who's had the snow, anyone who's been lucky enough to have these snow days, that you've been enjoying it. It's definitely still beautiful here in the Netherlands. So yes, as always, you can now go onto Slido. So that's sli.do. And so that's for the Q&A session. So if you go to that page and then the hashtag, so the password to get in is OPW for Ocean Plastic Webinars. And that's where you can ask your questions, right? So don't go to the YouTube Q&A, just go straight into Slido. All right, so I'm going to quickly introduce Lauren and then hand over the floor to her. So Dr. Lauren Biermann is a marine remote sensing scientist with a background in molecular biology, oceanography, biogeochemistry, and optics. Wow, that's a lot. Since joining Plymouth Marine Laboratory in 2018, she has worked primarily on the use of optical satellite data for detection and identification of floating macroplastics in riverine and marine environments. Lauren is also leading the EUMETSAT Ocean contract, training postgraduate and early career scientists to access and apply remote sensing data from across the Copernicus Marine Data stream. So great, thank you so much, Lauren, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Delphine. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen.
Yeah, great.
Yes, so hi, I'm Lauren, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we can use high-resolution optical satellite data to detect floating macroplastics, patches of macroplastics in the marine environment and in rivers. And this is certainly not a solitary piece of work. I have a lot of co-authors, but I'll mention them as I go. There we go. So one of the things I wanted to start with, the perspective that I bring into my work really was neatly summed up, I think, in a report that was funded last year by the Tier Fund organization. And they showed that across just 6 countries, 4 companies, Coca-Cola, Nestle, PepsiCo, and Unilever, create enough plastic pollution, so that's plastic that's dumped or burnt, every day to cover 83 football pitches. Now, I really like this because when people start to talk about millions of tons or billions of tons, my brain doesn't really know how to connect to that information. And so what I really like about this is that if I close my eyes, I can think of a football pitch. I know exactly what that size is, particularly because we had a physical education teacher in my high school who used to make us run laps. So I know how big a football pitch is. And if you think about it, every 20 minutes one is filled. So in the time that you and I are going to spend together today, 3 football pitches are going to be filled to a depth of 10 centimeters with discarded plastics from 4 companies. That's it. What's exceptional about this as well is that the open burning of these plastics creates the same amount of emissions as 2 million cars being operated. So it's not just a question of litter that we can see, it's also about the component that we don't see, which contributes to climate change. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this report is that it focuses on just 6 countries, China, India, the Philippines, Brazil, Mexico, and Nigeria. And it largely leaves out North America and Europe, which is interesting because North America and Europe are big contributors and consumers of plastic products. And the stats really globally and historically are staggering. And this is where we get into these numbers that we can't really connect with, right? So 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic have been produced since the 1950s. I don't know about you, but like that doesn't really resonate with me. But what does resonate with me is the fact that of all plastics ever produced, only, well, less than 10% have ever been recycled. I know what 10% of something looks like. And so to me, the idea that this inconceivable number of plastic has been produced and less than 10% of it has ever been recycled, that's something that stops me in my tracks. Why is that? Well, the answer is that because, I don't know if you know this, but the raw materials of plastics are fossil fuels. It's oil, gas, and coal. And it is more viable and so more viable for petrochemical industries to continue to extract fossil fuels to make plastics from scratch. And it is also cheaper to make plastics from scratch than it is to try and recover them through the process of recycling. Secondly, recycling is really inefficient when it comes to plastics. So even this like perfect plastic water bottle that I use when I go cycling, if I put this in the recycling bin, if I'm really lucky, it's going to end up as fibers or as road fill. More than likely, though, it's going to end up as landfill. And if we're really unlucky, this plastic bottle in the UK is going to be transported to Southeast Asia, where it is either going to be burnt or it's going to end up in the ocean. So the recycling message that we've been sold on purpose. And it's a big con, unfortunately. Recycling is not going to get us out of this mess, but it certainly wouldn't be your fault to have believed that previously. Because since the 1990s, there's been a lot of push in the media about bigging up recycling. And a lot of this bigging up has been bankrolled by companies like Exxon, Chevron, Dow, and DuPont. And these are the guys who have a vested interest in ensuring that they can continue to extract fossil fuels. And they've been pushing the recycling message despite the fact that they have known since the 1970s that recycling is inefficient and expensive and not going to work. So that's longer than I've been alive. So if we can accept that plastics, which are a useful material, will continue to be produced. And now that we understand that recycling isn't the perfect answer, it's not going to get us out of that mess, we have to acknowledge that a proportion of plastic waste will enter our rivers and will enter our oceans. And you don't need to know big numbers like 8.3 billion tons to understand that we don't want any plastic entering our oceans, but it's inevitable. And through the webinar series, you'll have heard from people like Eric van Zerbill, who talks about these big ocean circulation models, and he shows you where plastic ends up, and it's absolutely brilliant. And then from other people like Tim van Emmerik, you've heard about fieldwork studies where they've stood on bridges and literally counted pieces of plastic go past. But in between that is where I think satellites have got a useful role. They kind of join up these really big circulation models with these very fine scale in situ fieldwork studies. But the reason satellites haven't been used before is because it was only really last year that it was demonstrated for the first time that satellites could be used to detect marine macroplastics. And the limitations historically have been quite valid. And it's really only thanks to the Copernicus program, the European Commission funds this program, that we have access to high resolution, top-notch satellite data from a range of sensors. And this data is available completely for free to me and to you. And that's pretty remarkable. And I'm more than happy to answer questions later about the different types of satellites and the type of data available to us. But I'm specifically going to talk about Sentinel-2 and the way it sits in that Goldilocks zone. It has enough spatial resolution, so it collects data at 10-meter spatial resolution, and it also has sufficient spectral resolution for us to be able to detect plastics and other floating debris in the marine environment. But I'm happy to answer questions later, but for now, just trust me that Sentinel-2 is the right instrument for the job. And one of the reasons for that, is its spectral resolution. So I'm going to anthropomorphize Sentinel-2 for a moment here, and I'm going to talk to you about its eyes. So you and I, we can see in the visible range of light. So we can see colors that range from blue all of the way to red. Sentinel-2 can do that too, but its remarkable eyes can also see into the electromagnetic spectrum parts that humans can't see into. So it can see into the near infrared, all of the way into the shortwave infrared. So its eyes are really special. And I'm going to demonstrate that by using a typical Sentinel-2 image. This one was collected off Da Nang in Vietnam. So for those of you who've been housebound for a while, it's a little bit of an exotic journey. This is the coastal zone. The marine protected areas sit just below over here. And this is quite a hazy image, a Sentinel-2 image. And you and I are going to quickly do an atmospheric correction. So we're going to remove the contribution from the atmosphere, and suddenly things are a lot clearer. This sub-mesoscale feature is absolutely beautiful, and you can see a lot going on in the water. And this image over here, we've asked Sentinel-2 to use data from the red, the green, and the blue to recreate what we would see if we were looking down on this area ourselves. But now we're going to ask Sentinel-2 to show us what it sees in the near infrared. And this is an incredibly valuable trick that Sentinel-2 can do. So I'm going to ask you to focus on one of these areas, and I'm going to move from the visible into the near infrared now, using Sentinel-2's eyes. And what you should have been able to see there is that things that were quite indistinct or almost invisible are now quite visible. There's loads of little boats on the water that we didn't see very well previously. So if I go back to the red, the green, and the blue, they're practically invisible. And I've enhanced this image. I've brightened it to even make it easier for you to see. But when you look in the near infrared, you can see these images. Why is that? Well, this is a very simple thing, actually. Water is really efficient at absorbing light in the near infrared wavelengths. So what it's doing is it's sucking all of the near infrared out, and anything that's on the surface of the water is reflecting. And we just leverage that. So here's another example of Ghana. Here is a non-atmospherically corrected true color Sentinel-2 image. We're going to apply the atmospheric correction. There we go. And what we can see over here is sargassum seaweed. There's a long line of it and some beautiful coastline. And now we're going to ask Sentinel-2 to show us what it sees in the near infrared. And I'm going to ask you to look over here, but also if you're interested, look at this area over here. And here we go into the near infrared. And suddenly you can see tons of little boats in the coastal zone. And you can also see windrows now. And those windrows have gathered debris into patches. And in fact, in this windrow over here, there are pixels of plastic. So the multispectral instrument is Sentinel-2's eyes. It's passive, so it needs sunlight reflected from the Earth's surface. It can't see through cloud or collect data under poor light conditions or at night. We get 10-meter resolution data over land because it's ostensibly a terrestrial satellite, but also adjoining coastal waters, which is where we work. There are 2 satellites, and that allows high-resolution data to be collected more often. And it also means that if something happens to one of the Sentinel-2s, there's another one to continue operationally collecting data. Now, let's get to what you're all here for. How I use Sentinel-2 to detect plastic patches. One moment, though. Before I do that, I just want to confirm what I mean when I talk about plastics. I'm talking about macroplastics. Now, in the literature, this is defined as fragments or items that are bigger than, larger than 5 millimeters. But actually, what I'm talking about is the stuff you can hold in your hand. It's the polystyrene takeaway container that you got your dinner in last night. It's your water bottle. And when I talk about where I'm detecting it, I want to remind you that I'm looking at coastal waters only, but that's okay because that's where most of the plastic leaks into the ocean. The third thing that's not on the list, but is worth mentioning, is that I'm only able to look at plastics right on the surface of the water. Even a few millimeters, water is so efficient at absorbing in the near infrared that I wouldn't be able to see it, even if it's just a few millimeters below the surface. But either way, if the plastics entering the coastal zone are not recirculated onto beaches, if they don't sink, or if they're not removed from active cleanup operations, plastics will enter the open ocean where they're free to do all sorts of nefarious things. I'm not going to show you horrible images, but you know what I'm talking about. They're free to become ingested. They're going to entangle marine life. And through the process of mechanical action from waves or UV degradation, even the biggest fragments may eventually break down into microplastics, contributing to that global load, which is impossible to remove. So this is our incentive for trying to detect macroplastics using satellite data. Sentinel-2A and B have been collecting data since 2015 and 2017, respectively. We get data every 2 to 5 days, and we're limited by things like cloud and wave caps. And more specifically, though, we're reliant on things called sub-mesoscale features. And all that is really, it's a front or a river plume edge or an eddy. And what you can see over here, I think this video illustrates it nicely. I'll play it from the beginning so you can see it again. Here's a guy, he's raising awareness about plastic pollution, and what he's swimming towards is a patch, but actually what he's swimming towards is a front. And this front has nicely grouped the materials for us. So we have plant materials, the bright white spots of plastics. And if we assume that Professor Johnson is about 6 foot with his fins on, then that's about the size of a 10 meter by 10 meter pixel from Sentinel-2. Now, you and I know because we've just seen that there's plastics in there, but to Sentinel-2, we've got three things in here. We've got water, we've got the plant debris, and we've got the plastics themselves. But you already know that we can leverage the near-infrared as well as other information across the bands that Sentinel-2 provides to try and unmix these pixels. And we do that using two indices: a normalized difference vegetation index, which is used very widely in the terrestrial environment, and also one that we came up with ourselves at Plymouth Marine Labs called the floating debris index. You don't need to know anything on the slide. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we do the atmospheric correction that we use as acolyte, and the floating debris index, all it really does is it leverages the heck out of the near infrared. And what it's really good at is subpixel detection. What I mean by that is the following. So if you would do me the courtesy of reading the slide from right to left, we're going to start off with a drone red, green, and blue image, so a true color image, of three targets that the remote sensing group at the University of the Aegean put out a few years ago. And they've been doing this work for the last 3 years, and it is entirely the reason that I could do any of my own work. So this target over here is made from plastic bags. This target over here is made from netting. So, and this target over here is made from water bottles. And if we take the same scene from Sentinel-2, I've really enhanced this. I've brightened it as much as possible to show off these targets. You see that it's pretty hard to see those targets. But when we apply the floating debris index, as you can see, it lights up very nicely. So we can see those three targets from low Earth orbit. If we zoom in some more, this study and this work by the Marine Remote Sensing Group was absolutely sort of seminal at laying down key information. The first thing is that subpixel detection is possible, but also that not all plastics are created equal. So what we see here is that in order to see plastic bottles in a patch, we need less than 30% of the pixel to be filled for it to be detectable. However, for fishing nets and plastic bags, we need upwards of 50%, if not 55% of that pixel to be filled. And so what that means is it's going to be harder to detect derelict fishing gear and plastic bags compared to plastic bottles. But if we combine these data, what we got from all of the work that the Marine Remote Sensing Group at the University of Aegean did was we were able to create a signature of what plastic looks like. And then we went and found everything else that floats in the marine environment: seaweed and driftwood and even sea foam. And we said, okay, what do you look like spectrally? And this is what we got. So here's our lineup. And basically, I know these spectral signatures better than the back of my hand right now. So if we start with water, on the x-axis, we have our wavelength. So this is blue, green, and red. This is the near-infrared peak. So what you can see is water absorbs strongly in the near-infrared, and everything floating on the water, and you can ignore the pumice over there, reflects in the near-infrared, and then we have the shortwave infrared over here. And the remote sensing reflectance signatures are just based on what the materials are composed of. So for example, timber or driftwood, which is a browny reddish color, has a peak in the red. That's not surprising. And seaweed has a peak in the green because it's green. But it also has activity. It's got this little shoulder in the red edge, and driftwood has got some interesting information in the second near-infrared band. And for example, driftwood, it's bright and it's white. So obviously we see this nice big peak in the visible, and it's huge compared to the peak in the near-infrared, and so on. So we now know what different materials look like, and this is pretty consistent. And plastic, what we found, it doesn't have much of a sort of consistently different spectral signature. It tends to follow the shape of the water and just show a peak in the near-infrared. But we use this information to be able to identify plastics out there. The problem mainly is that even though the University of the Aegean has been putting targets out for 3 years, we still only have 9 perfect pixels of plastics, whereas we've got many, many more of everything else that floats on the water. So what we needed was more plastic. And if you can't get perfect plastic, you go to the next best thing, which is validated plastics. And KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa had severe floods in April 2019. And I don't know about you, but I find this amount of plastic absolutely staggering. This is what was washed up on the beaches and into the water within a few days of this flood. And I was in contact with Grant Blakeaway. This is Grant. He's standing at Durban Harbour, and he took meticulous records of when these plastics were recirculated out of the harbour and into the open ocean. And on that day, we had a gap in the cloud, and I was able to detect about 40 pixels of plastics. Even though they're mixed, they were very dominated by plastics, and we were able to use those pixels as extra validation for what plastics look like in the wild. And if you look at how plastics and other debris group according to NDVI, there is some nice sort of information, and the same is true for floating debris index. But actually, the real value comes when you look at it together. So if you show all of these materials in two variable feature space, what you can see is clustering. So in gray is the debris that we looked at from Durban. So that's the plastic that we detected in the wild. And in black are the targets from the University of the Aegean. And you can see that they overlap really nicely. This over here is sea foam, the red is driftwood, and the green is sargassum and different types of seaweed. And even though they're different, they cluster really nicely together. And of course, water is over here. So knowing that these materials cluster nicely meant that we could potentially use the information to train a machine learning model. So we went for a Bayesian classification of plastics. And we tested if it was possible to automate classification, because it's all good and well me saying that looks like plastic, but actually we need something a little bit more robust. And the naive Bayes machine learning approach really worked very well. It requires a small number of samples, assumes independence, and using information from the floating debris index, the normalized difference vegetation index, and a ratio that I haven't talked about yet, and several of the bands. What it does is it takes a pixel that I've said, hey, I think this is debris, and it goes, actually, the probability is that it is debris, or I think it's seaweed. And so it assigns it based on the data it's been trained with. So this is a day in the life of a scientist trying to find plastic from space. I look at the literature every day. I review social media posts looking for plastic pollution hashtags. And then if I see something interesting, I'll go and look at that area from Sentinel-2. If it's cloud-free and there's a sub-mesoscale feature, I'll download that data and I'll do some processing. This can take me up to half a day per scene. I do the atmospheric correction. I use the floating debris index to find suspected materials. There's a nice front that you can see. And then I look at the spectral signatures of each of those pixels and I say, yep, you look like plastic. I then gather all of those pixels. I feed them into the naive Bayes classifier, which fortunately, compared to everything else, only takes seconds to minutes to run. Of course, it did take months for us to make that training data set. So it's an incredibly onerous and time-consuming process. It is a lot like looking for a needle in a haystack, but of course it's really worth it because it's very robust and reproducible, even if it is time-consuming, which means it allows us to go find macroplastics in the wild. So I'm going to take you through two examples. The first one is off Accra in Ghana. And I picked this one mainly because of the work that Richmond Quaryu is doing in Ghana. He is running something called Plastic Punch. Please go look it up, give it some love. He's doing phenomenal work, doing cleanups on the beaches, removing huge amounts of plastic, which means that they're not going to make it back into the ocean. This is a true color image. The water is absolutely beautiful. And when you apply the floating debris index, what you have here is a mix of sea foam, sargassum, and some plastics. So this was a study site where we found a fair amount of plastics that the naive Bayes classifier said, yep, you found plastics. The second one is Honduras Bay. I'm raising this one because it's thanks to the work that Ekaterina Kikaki has done in her paper over here, looking at the Caribbean Sea and the Bay of Honduras. She's found incredible sort of backing information about the amounts of plastic entering the Caribbean Sea. So this is a video taken of the Motagua River in Guatemala by Julio Perdomo. And please also, this guy's super active on Instagram and he's really worth a follow. He is doing his best to raise awareness about plastic pollution in Guatemala and also doing his best to clean it up. So he's become a councilman and he's deploying booms to try and catch all of these plastics. And by the way, everything you see on the surface of the river here is plastic and it is just flowing into the ocean unimpeded. So please do go find him on Instagram and give him some love. And here's another picture of the work that he's been doing, catching all of these plastics in booms. It's just extraordinary. And you just think, I can't possibly be detecting that much plastic in the bay, but actually that's how much plastic is just flowing into the ocean. So Katerina did some really great work in capturing all of the in situ data around the Bay Island, around the islands in the Bay of Honduras. And in some of them, there were Sentinel-2 overpasses. So I also went and took a look and found plastics where she had seen plastics in situ. And so I'm just going to give you an example of what it looks like when I pick the perfect pixels and I ask the classifier to confirm or deny if what I found is definitely plastic. And this is what we got. So I should probably at some stage change that from possibly plastic to probably plastic, but because I've obviously coded it. But where I spotted debris and thought, yeah, that's plastic, the classifier agreed. Seawater was identified as seawater, seaweed was identified as seaweed, and driftwood was identified as driftwood. So the classifier is working very well at being able to identify different classes of debris that we find very commonly floating in the marine environment. So in red are the cases that made it into our paper, but in black are places where we have been collecting data continuously behind the scenes. But I wanted to share this map because I wanted to just remind people that plastic pollution in the marine environment is a global problem. It's not a developing world problem. I'm just as likely to find plastics in Canada as I am to find them in Bali. And I'd like to think of plastics as a bit of a democratizer because we need to work together if we're going to get ourselves out of this problem. So what we've demonstrated with the work I've done over the last 2 years really is that plastic has a spectral signature. The floating debris index is great at helping us detect objects on subpixel scales. And the naive Bayes classifier, even though it's simple, it's really great at helping us classify different materials. But I hope at no stage did I lead you to believe that this work is straightforward or simple. It's not. It's fiddly and it's tricky. It's an exercise in the needle in a haystack. We need to do a lot more work on atmospheric correction, the impacts of turbidity, and we need to work in river waters. But mainly we need more in situ data. So if you're in the audience and you're like, hey, I have in situ data, please get in touch with me. I will do anything for that data. Well, what's next? I think I've sort of led into that. I've become completely obsessed with atmospheric correction. So we're looking at doing a data-driven alternative to atmospheric correction, still early stages. My Python skills are not what they could be, but I've been getting help from some Python ninjas. Ben O'Driscoll, Edward Boyder, and Stuart Lynn have been helping me with this work. In the meantime, I've been looking at a post-atmospheric normalization and scaling step to minimize contributions from background water types, allowing us to work in more turbid waters. It also shows promise for thin clouds. So there's a lot going on in this image. There's a huge turbidity plume over here, which is interfering with debris that's inside the plume. And if I apply this normalization step, it really flattens out the water types, which is helping a lot. I also have a European Space Agency funded project in collaboration with Skyflux called AirSOS, where we're really we've got a seaplane and we're putting lots of really cool instruments on it, some multispectral instruments, so that it can fly over the Elbe River mouth. The Elbe emits about 450 tons of plastic pollution per year, most of it apparently on the surface. So we're going to see what we can see in these highly tidal and turbid coastal waters so that we can get a library of floating debris in these incredibly turbid conditions, with the idea that perhaps in future, small commercial airplanes can be instrumented with multispectral instruments for plastic detection as well. I have another European Space Agency funded project in collaboration with Wageningen University, Tim van Emmerik and Louise Schreiers, and our local partners in Vietnam. We also have support from NOAA from this. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the role of an invasive free-floating freshwater plant called water hyacinth in collecting and transporting plastics downstream to the ocean. So we're using a combination of in situ work. What you can see over here is this over here is a sampling net. It's about 1 meter long. And these are the hyacinth patches that are gathering plastic debris and transporting it downstream. What you can see over here is a radar image. This is Sentinel-1, freely available radar data. And you can see the hyacinth moving downstream with all of that plastic pollution ostensibly included. Thanks to NOAA, we also have access to very high resolution data from Worldview in the hope that we can eventually unmix pixels so that we know how much of it is plant and how much of it is plastic. And while we're talking, Louise has already published a paper on this. It's in preprint. Water hyacinth is a driver of plastic transport in tropical rivers. It's definitely worth a read because everything that we're doing in the Saigon is hopefully going to be relevant to tropical to subtropical rivers all over the world, because that's how far water hyacinth has spread. And so while we were working on this project, we thought, well, if we're going to go out of our way to look at the role of water hyacinth transporting plastics, we'd obviously like to remove those plastics, but why don't we also remove the hyacinth? It's an invasive species and it's really problematic. And that's led to an incredible project. I'm super excited to announce Flipper. It's recently been funded by the Norwegian Retailers Environment Fund. We're going to remove plastics and hyacinth to a depth of 60 centimeters. We're demonstrating it on the Saigon River. We're hoping to show improved river navigability, water quality, and biodiversity. And Plastic Fisher are the geniuses behind the prototype Flipper. We're also working with Poseidon Data, Wageningen University, Tim Van Emmerich, and NOAA. And we're also excitingly in talks with companies like Adidas who are interested in seeing how they can, if they can turn this water hyacinth into materials like vegan shoes. So let's see how that goes. I'm also very privileged to be able to work with Mary Curley. She's the force of nature behind the Oceans Voyages Institute, and every year she manages to get enough funding to get boats out there to physically remove ghost nets, the derelict fishing gear. Last year, she removed over 100 tons of the stuff, and this year she's committed to removing 1 million pounds of ghost nets in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and we're hoping to support that work with some satellite data. And finally, a piece of work that I'm really excited about, thanks to the Minderoo Foundation who are funding this, is the Global Plastic Watch Plastic Polluters Index. Now, you may already intuitively know this, but countries responsible for the investing in and the producing of plastics are often not the ones that are most impacted by plastic waste. And in fact, most of the plastics that can impact an entire country can be traced back to about 100 people who sit on executive boards of investment companies. And that's where we keep our money. And thus, it's also where we have a voice. So I'm really excited to be involved in that work. And please keep an eye on what Minderoo is doing. They're about to make an announcement about that work. Okay. I'm also very lucky to be sat at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, where there's a hotbed of research in micro to macroplastic research that stems from microplastic research all the way to ecosystem services. So I'll just quickly take you through some examples. EUMETSAT has got the Hyperdrone project funded by ESA. This is really exciting. He's got some really cool drones collecting data. Their eyes can see all of the way far into the shortwave infrared. And what he's been seeing is that actually those far shortwave infrared bands contain a lot of information about plastics. And that kind of information is really interesting to organizations like the European Space Agency, because they would like to put satellites into low Earth orbit that are more well designed for the detection of plastics. So this has real relevance for future work. And here you can see examples of what plastics on the beach look like in the visible and the near infrared compared to the shortwave infrared, where they're much easier to see. So that's ASER's work. Then Victor Martinez Vicente has also got a few ESA-funded projects. One of them is Frontal. He's looking at how fronts aggregate materials. He's using satellite data as well as model data, because the marine protected areas that you and I looked at around Da Nang are affected by a lot of riverine input of plastics. There's intense aquaculture, there's tourism pressures, and he's looking at these frontal hotspots of macroplastic and microplastic aggregation, and that information can go back to stakeholders. So this is quite a holistic project, which is really exciting. He's also leading the Simpler project along with Liz Atwood. And this is really cool because they're looking at microplastic flux rates. So that's because sediment plumes tend to contain microplastics. And so they're looking at the relationship between sediment and microplastics and the river discharging amounts of microplastics into the ocean. And that's a nice piece of work as well. And then, of course, I think PML are kind of more well known for their microplastic research, and that's because we've got a decade of absolutely groundbreaking research led by people like Penny and Matt and Rachel. They have done sort of groundbreaking work on sampling and extracting microplastics from water, sediments, and from animals. They've also highlighted the extent to which animals throughout the marine food web are affected by microplastics. They showed in the lab that these little critters, these marine plankton, ingest microplastics, and then of course are then sort of moved through the food web. And of course, you know, humans also eat fish. And they've shown how toxic these microplastics are to these little critters as well. And finally, you know, sort of completing the circle and making this research quite holistic, we have Nicola Beaumont, who's leading the social and economic impacts, and she's looked at ecosystem services and the negative impact the marine plastic pollution has on that. And she's worked it out to be at least $3,000 to $33,000 US per ton of plastic. The negative impact or loss to marine ecosystem services. So I just wanted to end with this slide to thank Ocean Plastic Webinars for having me. I want to thank you for your attention, for learning about the work that I do, and specifically I want to thank everyone in my village who's been helping progress this work, because as I said, plastic it's a fiddly and tricky problem, but it's incredibly pervasive and important that we do this work. And it is going to take a village to try and tackle this problem. And I'm very lucky to work in an incredible village of people and scientists. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was incredible. You do such awesome work, and it has so many applications to so many projects, and it looks like, you know, you're really having kind of a global reach. It's super exciting to see. Yeah. So I would like to remind everyone that you can ask Lauren some questions. So it's on sli.do, and you'll see that there you can put in a little hashtag, a password to get in, and it's OPW, so for Ocean Plastic Webinars. And there you can just type your question. You can also see the questions that other people have written, and you can upvote them. So you can like them, and the ones which have the most likes will come up at the top, and I'll ask Lauren those questions first. So while people are typing their questions, I had, it's kind of more of a logistical question about the actual satellite. So firstly, you're obviously working with Sentinel-2, and I was wondering how much longer that's it's planning to stay active.
Oh, that's a great question, actually. So what I love about the Copernicus program is they've really thought into the future. So we have Sentinel-2A and B at the moment working as a pair, but Sentinel-2C and Sentinel-2D are already planned. So as soon as there starts to be some data integrity issues with Sentinel-2A, if it starts operating beyond its lifetime, then Sentinel-2C will be launched, and D. Okay. So the whole purpose of the Copernicus program is to create an uninterrupted sort of time series that goes way into the future. And hopefully soon we may have a plastic dedicated mission, which would be very technically interesting.
Yeah, super cool. And so do they plan to increase the resolution? So I guess that you're you know, now you were saying that it can detect plastic that you can hold in your hand, like a plastic bottle. What is the smallest piece of plastic that can be detected right now, and what do they kind of foresee in the future, as you know, within the next years? Do you have any idea on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's super dependent on what plastic we're looking at. So if it's polystyrene, that is actually really easy to see. And we don't know how much of a pixel needs to be filled with polystyrene, but I would say it's probably better than even plastic water bottles. So if we had a big chunk of polystyrene, I would say we could probably detect that from space. I would say as long as it filled about 30% or 20% of a pixel, which is still quite big, right? Satellites like Worldview are showing really good potential, and they're at sort of meter to 2 meter resolution. They don't quite have the spectral resolution of Sentinel-2. Their eyes are designed a bit differently, but we are seeing evidence that they can detect plastics and distinguish plastics from other floating materials. But I think if ESA were to go ahead, it's quite tricky to get better resolution, but I think it can be done. And if we could get 3-meter resolution, that would probably be amazing. And then have more information in the shortwave infrared. I don't know if it's possible. It's probably me asking quite a lot. Isa's probably sitting there going, oh God, not again. Like, she's just asking way too much. But yeah, there are different ways to do it. And
yeah. Okay, right, so I'm gonna go to Slido. So everyone keep asking your questions. For now, we have quite a few, so I'll start from the top. So Riata, who's also in the Ocean Plastic Webinars team, asks, what happens if the surface of plastic bottles are covered by wet algae or something else that, could, So is it basically still detectable if it's covered by something else?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't know how much of a role biofouling has, but I imagine that it would be big enough, especially if an object, so for example, let's continue talking about this big piece of polystyrene, right? Let's say it's been in really productive waters and it's covered in slime. Is that going to look like a plant to me, or is that going to look like polystyrene? The truth is we don't know, because we've never been able to validate that question on the ground. I would assume that if it's photosynthetically active, so if that biofilm is really like active, full of algae and stuff, it's going to look like a plant to me.
Of course, yeah.
So that is problematic, but at the moment, that's theory. I have never been able to test that in the wild. It would be fascinating to check that out, yeah.
So more projects ahead, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a next question from Audrey. So can your method characterize sargassum as well? Do you have ongoing projects with teams to look at this? So yeah, I guess this is the spectrum, that you were mentioning. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. So sargassum spectrally looks really different from green sort of seaweeds. So I looked at green tides in the South China Sea to get that big sort of those big aggregations of algae, and those are very bright green. And it also looks very different to water hyacinth. So in fact, if you did want to leverage this information for distinguishing sargassum from other types of seaweed, I would say that's more than possible. It's not something I've looked at specifically. It was just something that I noticed as interesting. So I'm glad that that's interesting to someone else so I can talk about it. Yeah, it looks spectrally quite unique. And I know Hugh has been working on that from sort of MODIS and MERIS data. But yes, from Sentinel-2, you can tell those apart. So if you want some more information on that, I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that she was mentioning that they have a project that could be launched looking at this. So yeah, it might be interesting for some more collaborations there.
Yeah.
Great. So now we have another question from Florence Kutat. Can you get a quantification of the plastics from the satellite images? So I guess this is just either mass or a number of plastic within a pixel, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, Florence, that's a really good question, and it's one that weighs on my mind quite a lot. So because of the bias to the type of plastic within a pixel, so the floating debris index does give a measure of fullness. So if it's very high, it means that the pixel is very well filled. If it's below a certain point, then it kind of gets to the point where you're like, is this mainly water? And I'm not that confident. So it definitely gives you a measure of fullness, but it's biased by the type of plastic. So if it's polystyrene or plastic bottles, then it's going to say I'm super full, compared to even if it's 60% filled with nets, it might only be 20% filled with polystyrene. So it's always biased. I think we've got a long way to go before we can have a straightforward conversion from detectability to quantification, which is frustrating for me because that's obviously what I'd like to do. But yeah, we definitely can't run with that yet.
Right. So if I understood correctly, then you can right now say this is most probably plastic, but you can't really tell what type of plastic it is when you just look at the images because of this difference of okay.
Some work that's been done in the lab with hyperspectral data is showing that there is a lot of information about the different types of plastic within that spectral sort of work, but that's just kicking off. But it's really promising. And so I think eventually I'll be able to say, yes, absolutely, we can now use this to quantify plastics.
Yeah. Wow. Really exciting. Okay, so we have one question from Matthias Alday. So great presentation, thanks. Do you think it is possible to use the plastic detected from sentinel images as a tracer to estimate surface currents?
That's a really good question. I would say yes, absolutely. We've been doing that with chlorophyll and with fronts. The problem with the satellite data is the moment you're trying to get an idea of flux or movement, you're getting an image, if you're lucky, in a cloud-free area every 2 to 5 days. And so you can, as long as you have the ability to trace something in cloud-free imagery and it's not moving so fast that you can still trace it every 2 to 5 days, then absolutely. And in fact, in Katerina's paper, she does similar sort of work to that. The problem is if you've got 2 cloud-free days, then suddenly it's 2 weeks later. If you've got 2 really cloudy days, suddenly it's 2 weeks later, and something that you're trying to trace from source to sink, you've completely lost that information. So yes, in theory, exactly. But yes, if you are working in an area or over a season where that's not so much of an issue, then yes, you can absolutely trace where things go, as long as in that time they don't sink or become dispersed by wind, because wind is a great disperser of these sort of patches. So you have to really have perfect conditions in order to do that, but certainly it's possible. Yeah.
And do you find that there are some kind of, sorry, this is a follow-up question, my own question, but do you find that there are some regions where, you've been detecting that, that, for example, that you won't have bad cloud cover for, a certain amount of time, and so you have more data in those regions than other regions, say?
Yeah, I mean, I always use, so when I'm teaching, I always use the Red Sea because our chances of getting cloud-free imagery are the best, right? But at the same time, I haven't seen debris, or I haven't really looked that closely. Most of the time, the places where we're seeing debris tend to be quite cloudy. I don't know why, but I mean, the Earth is cloudy, it's unavoidable. So I'm not really answering that question particularly well, but so far, I'm having to deal with a lot of cloud. Even so in Ghana, drones, even in Thailand, it's super cloudy.
I mean, with the monsoon and everything, it's,
absolutely. And that's where, you get the most amount of rainfall, you get the most amount of, stuff being washed into the ocean. And you're like, oh, I want to go see. And then it's just chock full of cloud for like a week. And then you've missed it.
Yeah, I guess it's highly linked, right? Because if you've got a lot of storms, you'll get a lot of debris landing in the oceans.
Exactly.
And then that's when you can't detect it. Well,
I mean, that Durban example where we found the validated plastics, like the gap in the cloud was tiny. And we were so lucky that it just happened to be over the harbor. Wow, and I could see plastics streaming off under the clouds, but I couldn't use that data.
Right. Yeah.
So clouds. And flood and plastics. Yeah.
So basically these this project with the drones would be great because if they just cover the regions close to the coasts where they know that there's a lot of influx from rivers, then that could be really interesting. Cool. Okay, let me go back to Slido. So Florence has another question. Is the code for processing the satellite images open source and available? Good question.
Yes. So, okay, my code is embarrassing. I think everyone starts with that, but I do have a GitHub and I can make it available. I'm just a bit shy because my code is a bit rubbish, but I actually want to make this point. So one of my big things is I believe all data and all information should be open access, right?
Yeah.
There is a reason that I haven't made my training data set completely open and available yet. And that is because there's still so much work that needs to be done to it. So this normalization process, the atmospheric correction doesn't always, it's not that it doesn't work, it's just that it works differently to some regions than other regions. It's the lack of consistency makes me nervous about releasing just raw data. But if people email me for access to that data, I've now decided that as long as they're aware of the caveats of the data being raw, unprocessed, not normalized, but it is atmospherically corrected with acolytes, which is as good as it gets, really. Then I'm more than happy to make the code and the data available with all of those caveats. So Florence, please do email me. I will happily make the code and source data available for you within those caveats. So
cool, awesome. Okay, and moving on to a question from Laura. Great presentation. In the stage 1 exploring step, how do you detect the Sentinel-2 data exhibiting a sub-mesoscale feature?
Okay, so I have this amazing website called EUMETSAT, and this is where I do my window shopping, right? So I'll be reading something on social media, or I'll find a new paper. I'll be like, ooh, for example, Honduras. And then I'll go onto EUMETSAT and I'll go and look at Honduras so I don't have to download any of the data. I can just window shop. So then I'll go and I'll look for cloud-free days around the date of what I just read about. And I'll see if it's super windy, then the data is probably not that great. But if it looks clear, I then use the ability to look at the shortwave infrared and near infrared bands on EUMETSAT to see if I can spot stuff in the water. Now, often spotting stuff in the water just means, well done, you found seaweed. But if I've read something saying it's not just seaweed, then I'll go, okay, this scene looks amazing. I'm going to download it and process it myself. And then I use Snap to actually go and look at the spectral shapes of the data and then extract those pixels after I've done an atmospheric correction and a whole bunch of other stuff. So
yeah. And this atmospheric correction, what does it include? I mean, I know that there must be a lot of complex steps to take, but yeah, is there a way you can summarize to us that know nothing about atmospheric correction?
Yeah, absolutely. So Acolyte is the one that we've chosen. It's specifically designed for high resolution optical sensors in the coastal zone. And Quentin is the one who has designed it. It's open source. You can go and download it from Arbans. And he has a really good forum where, unbelievably, if you ask a question, he'll get back to you in half a day. I don't know how he does it. He's busy saving the world and keeping tabs on his forum. It's amazing. But Acolyte removes the contribution of the atmosphere using a dark spectrum fitting algorithm, which is detailed in his papers. And what it does there is it looks for the darkest pixel in a scene and then basically does the correction based on that needing to be 0 in the near infrared or shortwave infrared or any other band. So I've explained it really poorly. I really hope Quentin's not listening to this, but you can read all about it in his work. And what's great about Acolyte is it has a GUI. You can run it from the terminal, and it's quite easy to turn into a batch process. But also the GUI is really easy to use. You just input where the data are and output what you want. And yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. And Audrey has another one. Can you infer the presence of subsurface or smaller size plastic? So I guess, yeah, you've kind of mentioned this in different answers to other questions, but yeah, you can summarize it again.
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't have a lot of in situ or sort of on the ground ways to validate it, but I would say my gut feel is that even if it's just a few millimeters below the surface, we're not really going to be able to see it. And if it's not going to sufficiently fill a pixel, I may be able to see something, but my confidence is going to be as such that I wouldn't necessarily report it. And because the machine learning algorithm is trained with confident data, it might just say, nah, I think that's seawater. And it does do that sometimes where I've detected something and I can see that peak in the near infrared. And the naive Bayes will say, actually, those values are too low. I'm putting that in the water category. Because, yeah, you need to have a pixel sufficiently filled for right. Very confident detection. And that's true for seaweed. It's true for everything else. Have a limit there.
Okay. And another question from Thierry Huc. Would it be possible to produce global maps of the floating debris index, or does it require too many images and processing?
I mean, the idea eventually is to have, and remember though, so Sentinel-2 doesn't collect data over the open ocean. It collects coastal waters, right? So eventually the idea is to hopefully have sort of a global data set of all of the coastlines through time since 2015 to look for floating debris. And NEODAS, which is based at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, are hoping to be able to offer that service. So wherever you are in the world, if you would like a floating debris index map, it's up to you to go and decide what is in that detected patch. But they're able to, they're starting to be able to offer that. But we don't want to sort of run before we can walk, which is why we're working so hard behind the scenes on atmospheric correction and the data-driven alternatives and the normalization, because eventually you want to be able to say, actually, here is your floating debris index map, and this is where we think you might have plastics or sargassum versus a different type of seaweed. But it certainly is possible to be able to roll that out. Neodash certainly have the computing power thanks to Magio. It's just a case of if people are keen, then we will provide it.
Right. Yeah. So just one last question, and then I'd like you to just give some kind of final thoughts and you know, where you see the most important collaborations. So you can kind of think about that while I ask you this last question. So does SWIR camera work to detect and even identify types of floating macroplastic debris on the sea surface, not only on the beach?
Yes, absolutely. So the shortwave infrared contains a lot of information that we're very eager to exploit. We're not so sure about the shortwave infrared until we've done a bit more work on the atmospheric correction for Sentinel-2. But certainly with Worldview 3, there is some exciting information in the shortwave infrared. And in the future, if missions do sort of move further into the longer shortwave infrared bands, then that is the information that I think we'll end up exploiting. We might eventually just throw away the visible and the near infrared and just go straight for shortwave infrared. Getting that at higher resolution is tricky, but I certainly don't think it's impossible. I'm quite excited to see what the next generation of sensors look like. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, so we just have a few minutes left. So if you could kind of summarize, you know, so we have people from all types of different backgrounds and different disciplines in science that are working on something to do with ocean plastic. And, you know, our kind of aim with these webinars is to connect people, and so that you can kind of, you know, express where you see the current gaps. And, you know, with your work, I think you've kind of mentioned it along the way that more data is needed. And yeah, so, you know, would that kind of be your overall message, you know, that you're, you know, this is where you could really work with other people working in this field?
Yeah, I would say, you know, if you are like me from a completely non-plastics background, but plastics became an unavoidable part of your research, which is unfortunately becoming increasingly true, know that you're part of a community of people who don't necessarily have training in that background and are learning as we go. And I think it's quite a collaborative community as well. And what's great about entering this realm of research is that I research something highly technical, and suddenly I'm helping springboard work into actual removal of plastics in rivers. And that is a great feeling in research, in academia. You know, you publish something and someone goes, I can use this to do meaningful work on the ground. And that's a great feeling. So if you're thinking about entering sort of plastics research, either on purpose or because you can't avoid it, know that the community is super active and that your research might be the reason that we're able to better remove something or put up better sensors. The other thing I would say is that we're not going to, our research, as much as it's interesting, certainly technically interesting to me, it's not solving the plastics problem. I think we know how to reduce plastics. It's to turn off the tap, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, if you are entering this world, just be aware of the fact that sometimes your days are incredibly heartbreaking. I watched that video of that river in Guatemala, and I was just like, I need a day to deal with this emotionally. And yeah, it's tricky stuff, but it's a great community, and we're working towards meaningful extraction and change. And the world is your oyster, really, because there's so many unanswered questions. There's so much data that still needs to be collected, and it's a really growing field. Yeah.
And do you have a database somewhere? Like, can people go onto a website somewhere and just, you know, connect with you to provide their data if, you know, they have some that's something that you can use?
Yeah, that's a good point. So again, I need to work, you know, if people email me, I'm more than happy to give you access to my GitHub, where the raw data sits, and where my code sits. But you know, if you know, I would, if people have data and they want to share, I think it would be a good idea to set something up. At the moment, there is the remote sensing task force. The IOCCG task force has just been announced, and we're hoping to create that central repository there. It's in its infancy. We're about to have a kickoff meeting, and I'm hopefully going to be able to talk more about that in the future. But that's the whole point of that, is to have a central place where we can share those ideas and the papers and the things that didn't work, as well as the things that worked, and all of the data. But until then, I think please contact me if you would like my data, or if you have data to share. I'm always excited to collaborate, and I don't want to hold things close to my chest. I just want to remind people of the caveats, that's all.
Yeah, for sure. Right, well, I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much, Lauren. It was super interesting. I at least was very entertained, and yeah, I learned a lot. So thanks so much for coming to Ocean Plastic Webinars, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. And as always, we're going to have our next monthly session that's in March. It's normally on the first Tuesday of the month. So just, check out our Twitter, and we'll send out our emails closer to the time. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Bye. I'm just checking if it's still live.